In this video, I'm looking at the game between Javokhir Sindarov and Rameshbabu Praggnanandhaa. Let's take a look at the standings going into this 10th round. You can see Sindarov, of course, out in front by 1.5. Really, it's a two-horse race by this stage. Giri, 1.5 behind, and he was playing against Nakamura. But let's concentrate on Sindarov and Praggnanandhaa. So Prag not having a great tournament. He's just under 50%. And Sindarov beat him, well, in this wild game in the first half of the tournament. But for Sindarov, it's a tricky one. How far do you push it? A draw would be okay, but you don't really want to play for a draw with white. That if you play too spinelessly, then you can give your opponent chances. So it's a tricky one. And an interesting matchup because of course, both these players are 20 years old. This is the 2005 generation. It's funny, we used to talk about the 1990 generation, players like Carlsen, Nepomniachtchi, Vacher Legrave, all born in 1990, but we've moved along. So it's the 2005 generation. And when they were playing as kids, they played quite a lot actually in, for example, Asian junior championships. Then Prag often had the better of Sindarov. And indeed last year, Prag beat Sindarov. So if Prag can find his feet, then he knows that he can match Sindarov. So let's take a look at this game. Sindarov against Praggnanandhaa. D4 from Sindarov. Good solid start, as usual. And very classical from both players. Now knight d7. Okay, so this can go in lots of different directions. Maybe a Slav, maybe a Cambridge Springs, classical Queen's Gambit declined. Who knows? Bishop f4. Okay, good position for the bishop. Bishop b4. So now it starts to look like a strange kind of ragazine. And knight e4. So this indicates that Prag wants a good fight. So there's pressure on the knight on c3. So that's protected with the queen. And now g5. Okay, so we're not going to get a calm game here. Sindarov is going to have a fight on his hands, so there's no kind of drifting calmly towards a draw. Now Sindarov, after precisely 11 seconds, played bishop g3. The most common move here is bishop e5, but bishop g3 is known, and h5. So that bishop is being chased down by these pawns. And Sindarov now thought for 6 minutes, 50 seconds. So quite a long think after, playing bishop g3 so quickly. So it seemed like he was a little bit unsettled, curious. But all will be explained later. So bishop d3, and this is very forcing now. Because after h4, you can see that bishop is actually running out of squares. So the knight was taken, and queen check. And the king stepped to f8. So, which looks very strange, but the white's problem is that after bishop e5, f6, you can see that bishop is trapped. So black is going to win a piece. Now, in this very forcing variation, what was curious was that Sindarov was taking a lot of time, or at least relatively speaking. He often plays very quickly. But, for example, in this position, he thought for over 11 minutes on his next move. And he played knight g5. And in fact, this has been played before. And, it's a theoretical line. So clearly if the knight is taken, then that bishop drops. Excuse me, the bishop takes the rook. The rook drops. So that bishop is eliminated, and then pawn takes knight. So let's take stock. Black is piece up. At the moment, white has 2 pawns for the piece. Black's king is rather exposed. It's vital that white opens lines here, because if black manages to develop this queen's bishop and get some kind of blockade on the light squares, then black is just winning. So you have to play vigorously here. And f4 played. And now it was Prag's turn to go into the tank and spend a lot of time. And he played here h3, so he spent over 20 minutes on this move. In fact, that's a pretty good move because it might well secure, some light squares here, possibly that square g4 for the bishop, but it basically starts to, open up the h-file, and it's clear that white's king is going to be on the king side. So it secures black some counterplay. Rook d1 from Sindarov again. He thought about that 11.5 minutes over that move. Queen e7. And then g3. Okay, stopping counterplay on the h-file. Pawn takes pawn. And Sindarov castled. So that brings his king's rook into the game. So we've got a really, really sharp position. And both players really feeling their way through this one. It seemed like, this wasn't just a case of the players just reproducing their home preparation. They were both unsure of this position. The variation somehow must have come as a surprise to both players. I'll explain later. Rook h6. Rook takes f4 check. And king g8 and rook f1. So I think at this moment, it's time for you to have a think. I'm going to have a drink of my beautiful Barry's tea. And yeah, black's problem is, how do you bring these pieces into play? Now it's quite clear that queen's bishop needs to develop. So question, would you play the queen's bishop to d7 or e6? That's your challenge. Which one is best? So I'll see you after this message.
I've seen many chessboards in my life, but when I heard about this one, I was keen to see it for myself. It's beautiful and completely wireless, thanks to an integrated battery and Bluetooth connection. For my edition, I wanted pieces that reflect clarity. When I play with them, everything feels natural. Just me, the board, and the game I love. This is my supreme chess set, the Daniel King edition.
In this position, Pragg played bishop d7. But that was a mistake. He should have played bishop e6. Now there's a forcing variation here. White can play rook f6. After this, exchange, another exchange. So the players would reach a rook and pawn endgame by force, and white is 2 pawns up. But actually, after rook d8, black has decent drawing chances, and it's still not over. But, well, the computer confirms this should be a draw. It's tricky, of course. But Pragg played bishop d7. mistake. And at this point, Sindarov thought for 8 minutes just to make absolutely sure that this was working. So he played rook f7. Good move. So black has to give up the queen. Well, exchange the queen for 2 rooks. If the queen moves, let's say queen e8, then rook comes back to f6. There'll be an exchange, and basically black's king is going to be attacked by queen and rook, and these pieces just can't get over to defend. So that's necessary. Now, if black could keep 2 rooks and the bishop against the queen, then that would be good news. But the problem is after this check, so the king has to move towards the rook. Queen g5 check. The king again has to stick by the rook, and then queen e7, and that wins the bishop on d7. So we've got a situation where there are 2 rooks against the queen. But in this case, it's very, very good for the queen because black's king is open and there's a lot of pawns on the board that white has. So white is, let me count them, 2 pawns up. Now for the moment, it seems like black could potentially have counterplay, with this pawn and the 2 rooks. But if white is careful, then this is actually very, very good. And it's the fact that black's king is so open that gives white's queen the opportunity to always check and find the right square. So queen g4 check. Yeah, you've got to be a little bit careful. If queen takes pawn, then rook b6 is not so clear, and then black has counterplay coming to one of these squares. I mean, obviously, rook b1 is an immediate threat. But Sindarov found a very clever way of playing, actually. This is excellent play. Queen g4 check. King h8. Now, this next move is a real flex. And maybe you'd like to have a little think about how you'd play this with white. Now, you can't push that e-pawn too quickly. I mean, that will be collected by the rooks. He played a4. I really like this move. Basically, if black does nothing, then that pawn will advance. So, for example, if king h7, then a5, and that pawn on b7 might be collected. And if b6, okay, well then we'll take that pawn. And you can see that the position is simplifying, and the white is just kind of clearing up here, basically. So Pragg decided to block with a5, but now that pawn is a target. Queen g5, okay, hits the rook. Then e6, okay, that pawn has to be collected, and then queen takes a5. Check. So keeping an eye on that pawn, but also that pawn as well. And then he collected that h-pawn. And once that pawn goes, then white's king breathes a sigh of relief. And king f2. The king plays a very nice part in the game, because if rook takes pawn, then queen h6 check, and then queen takes rook. Whoops, I misfired, but yeah, the queen could bounce back there. So Sindarov is now 3 pawns up, but I mean the crucial thing is it's the quality of the pawns. It's these connected pawns that are the danger for black, and there's really not a lot that Pragg can do to prevent these rolling down the board. And it's a lot of fun when the king is so exposed, because the queen can always bounce to a really good square. So there are going to be threats to check and take this rook. So the rook, well, that pawn is irrelevant by this stage. It's whether these pawns can advance on the king side, and they can actually very, very easily. So this is the game continuation. E4, yeah, again, can't be taken because there's a check here, and queen takes rook, winning pawn endgame. And the pawns just roll down the board. Lots of ways to win here. This is very nice. Queen d8, threatening h7. And after rook g8, queen d5 check. That was the final move of the game. Praggnanandhaa resigned here. Okay, let's just have a quick look at why he resigned exactly. If the king goes back, well, you could just play g5 here. You could also just take another pawn. The pins are very annoying. And then keep rolling the pawns, or rook e6. Again, g5 is very simple, followed by king g4, maybe king here. You know, white is going to be able to push those pawns very easily. It's just too much for black. So that was the final position. Again, a very confident attacking game from Sindarov. Now, let me explain what happened in the opening, because in the press conference, Sindarov revealed that he made a mistake in the opening. Here, he'd prepared this line. I mean, if not recently, but anyway, his intention was actually to play bishop e5, the most common move in the position. And it's still very, very complicated. But he simply said he played bishop g3 too quickly. And yeah, it was not his intention to play this. So to some extent, he said that he was actually improvising this whole line, which is extraordinary. He said he had seen it before. He knew it was kind of okay for white, but he had to feel his way through. So, I mean, that is very, very impressive and shows how confident he was. Confident he is in his own ability. And he mentioned another moment later on when it came to this critical moment where Pragg blundered with bishop d7. And the reason he thought for 8 minutes here, and he saw rook f7 very quickly, was that in the previous game, where he'd only drawn against Bluebaum and he'd achieved a winning position, but he played too quickly at the critical moment. And his coach had said to him, okay, just slow down. When you have a good position, just make absolutely sure before you rush in. And today it paid off. You know, he had the time. So, you know, he used it very wisely just to dot the I's and cross the T's. Also, another very interesting thing here that I was listening to Viswanathan Anand, of course, 5-time world champion, and he's a guest. Well, he's a FIDE representative, of course, FIDE vice president. He's in Cyprus. And he was on the commentary, and he said that he had actually analysed this some years ago. And he had actually analysed this rook and pawn endgame. And it shows, I mean, how well Anand is prepared, or was prepared when he was, you know, a professional playing, you know, all the time. But also that he was somehow ahead of the game. You know, he's a brilliant researcher. So fascinating stuff. Right, let's have a look at the standings after 10 rounds. Javokhir Sindarov out ahead with 8 points, and he now has a 2-point lead over Anish Giri, who drew against Nakamura. Somehow he was a little bit better, but he couldn't find a way to create problems. I think this is Giri's difficulty at this very highest level, that he doesn't know how to gamble somehow. Doesn't know how to stir things up. So that was just a draw, and the other games were drawn as well. So let's look at the pairings. Sindarov 2 points clear with 4 rounds to play. Now, today, Friday, is a rest day, so they'll resume on Saturday with round 11. Sindarov has black against Caruana. Now that is a big test. So that's one big test. And then in round 12, Sindarov has white against Nakamura. Well, Nakamura might come out of his shell and do something there. We don't know. That's an interesting one. And then in round 13, Sindarov has black against Giri. So the next 3 rounds are not so simple for Javokhir Sindarov. Let's see what happens. Oh, by the way, I should mention that the women's candidates tournament is wide open, and I'm delighted to say that Svetlana Demchenko is back with her round reports, so do check those out.